So, alhamdulillah, as we continue to other aspects of justice that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala demands, that our scholars have pointed out areas where justice are part of our tradition. In the Surah Al-Ma'idah, verse 8, Ya ayyuhal amanu kunu qawamin lillahi shuhada'a bil qist. That people that have that verb comma there as qawami, people who are establishers. Of course, he mentions here in the Arabic translation, "Oh, you who have believed, be persistently." So that interesting is the usage of that word. Qawam is the intensified active participle of the verb qama. Qawam, like nasar. So it means emphatically from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that people have to be consistent in declaring or witnessing, affirming equitableness. لا يجرمنكم شنآن قوم على ألا تعدلوا. And don't let, and this is interesting, this is an important verse. Keep in mind the idea that people who, which we seem to forget about as Muslims, we see this a lot, is that don't let your animosity, shana, towards people to make you not act equitably towards them. This is a really important concept for us to keep in mind. Be equitable. Huwa aqrabu lit-taqwa. This is that which is closest to being the first taqwa. And I'm going to turn it off. Let me take that. My wife will probably point to some really important reason. Oh, I forgot to turn my phone off. Bible only. Let's see if she comes back. Let me take a quick message there. Tell her I'm at the desk. Wherever she is. Fine. SMS. Etc. Devastating. Okay. وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ إِنَّ اللَّهَ خَبِيرٌ بِمَا تَعْمَلُونَ, and have this taqwa. Now, of course, taqwa has another very pregnant words that we want to really understand. We won't be able to cover that today, but the idea of qawa, the idea of avoiding something or to be cautious towards something. So in a sense of having caution in regards to Allah and being obedient and faithful to Allah and avoiding the things that are prescribed, etc. This is what taqwa should keep in mind. It means to, if you're fulfilling God's commands, avoiding things that are prohibited in Islam, etc. So this is the issue then about issues of people who are your opponent, how we should be. Interfaith relations. لا ينهاكم الله عن الذين لم يقاتلوكم في الدين ولم يخرجوكم من دياركم أن تبروهم وتقسطوا عليهم إن الله يحب المقسطين. Again, another of these, إن الله يحب المقسطين. Allah loves those people who are equitable. In the sense of people who are not actively opposing you. We're going to come back to this verse when we have the discussion of the hadith of Sayyid al-Mabuti's commentary to it. This is a verse that is indicating that those who would say that harshness towards kuffar, this verse number 9 in Surah Tawbah, abrogates this. This is one of the verses that are said to have been abrogated, but I think that's a weak position for those who hold that position. And so the idea of equitableness towards other people of faith. And then business, reading that there. وَلَا تَتَمَنَّوْا ما فضل الله به بعضكم على بعض للرجال نصيب مما اكتسبوا وللنساء نصيب مما اكتسبنا واسألوا الله من فضله إن الله كان بكل شيء عليم. The idea of in issues of business transaction, idea of iktisab or acquisition, that there has to be, it's a shared thing between men and women. Men and women have what they, and this could be one reading, issues of their amal and their accountability for God in that larger metaphysical concept of acquisition, or in a sense has been applied by legal theorists and commentators on issues of concept of equitableness by Muslim scholars is a verse that can be used to talk about economic and business equality among people, both men and women. Now from that then, we get into, after talking about, that was my sort of brief discussion on justice. So I think, and now if you really want more, you can get this book by Hashmi and read it. It's not a very large book, and it's a nice basic introduction on this idea that if you want to take it and further reading. But as for equality, or musawa in Arabic, this idea of being equal, musawi, we're speaking here on the idea of where we talk here about, so what I have here is type, we're talking about constitutional equality, idea of a constitutional structuring of equitableness. So we're talking about equality. So there are four types where, for example, the U.S. Constitution wants us to have equality before the law, before courts of justice, employment opportunities and welfare, and general duties, obligations, taxation, military. Well, does Islam offer also this type of issues that we would call constitutional equity, where the Constitution, let's say in the United States, wants us to have these types of equality before the law? So on the right there under text then, it's not a text from the U.S. Constitution, but a text in reference to the Quran or hadith that allow us then to understand, or our tradition, that would give us that we have an equivalence of understanding, or we can have that understanding, and it will not be inappropriate in an Islamic understanding of equivalence or musawiyat. So the Prophet ﷺ said, "O people, if I have flogged anyone wrongly, let him retaliate here and now. And if I have insulted anyone, let him reciprocate. If I have taken anyone's property, let him claim it and take it from me. Let no one fear any rancor on my part, for that would not be becoming of me. Be aware that the one who takes back his right from me is most dear to me, for I wish to meet my Lord with a clear conscience." So the Prophet is speaking to the people. This is before he passes away. The idea that he's the lawgiver. I mean, in the sense that he's, we use the concept of shari in the Islamic tradition. The shari is a lawgiver. Of course, God is the lawgiver. No, don't misunderstand me. Some Muslims even have a problem with the Prophet being called a shari. But in classical legal works, a shari is understood, the lawgiver, as Allah and His messenger. And leaving it at that, the Prophet ﷺ here then is speaking to us about, he as the lawgiver, come to me and take your right, whoever you may be. This is a teaching of his for us to understand that each person should have equality before the law. In this case, it's emphasized the Prophet himself. He will before you perish because they did not punish an old man among them if he committed theft, but enforced the punishment only on the weak. By God, if Muhammad's daughter Fatima committed theft, I shall not hesitate to cut off her hand. A well-known tradition. But from this, our jurists understand that there is to be no discrimination between those of high position in society as not. Now, this idea of social stratification is accepted by Islam, and one area where you would know that to be the case is issues of marriage, about a girl, a man who wants to marry a woman, make sure that he is of her status, for example. The idea of stratification of status, to think that Islam is some kind of communist, egalitarian thing, is not Islam, by the way. And you know how that atheist Prophet said the believers are like the tooth of a comb, but that's not necessarily a real teaching in a sense of neutral type of egalitarianism in Islam, because the Prophet, for example, he spoke of those who participated at Badr, for example, of having a preference over other Sahaba. That they would never do any wrong. Their mistakes are forgiven. They had a status. If you take the hadith, for example, that the Imam in Quraysh, that leaders are from the Quraysh, that's placing the Quraysh in a leadership position. Now, all scholars question the authority of that tradition and even its authenticity. But if you are citing that, for example, that would be one in that understanding. So, when the Prophet ﷺ spoke, we have this sort of like, I'm just a Muslim. Like, I'm just a Muslim. It's like, I'm just a Muslim. I'm not an American Muslim. I'm just a Muslim. Sort of like idea that goes like you don't hyphenate yourself in a way, or you don't qualify yourself. I'm just a Muslim. Well, that's a nice thing to say, and I'm sure that you really believe that. But you are. None of us are just a Muslim. I am a Muslim, and I can be qualified as an American Muslim. This is the Prophet said, I am Hashimi. I am of the Banu Hashim. He described himself as being from Banu Hashim. He described himself as being from the Quraysh. He described himself as being the best of the Arab, the best of the Arabs. He could describe himself in his own classification. So if he was some prophet teaching total neutrality, well, he didn't describe, obviously he wasn't speaking about himself. Okay? So that's one of those another utopic and false understandings that Muslims seem to have, that we're all sort of like totally equal. And this sort of like neutralization of Islam in some way, and trying to make it, the whole, I might call it under the rubric of deculturating Islam, where you want to take anything cultural thing from Islam and have to sort of like neutralize, sterilize Islam. I don't know what that means, but that is sort of a message out there. And you can never have that. I mean, as Muslims, we have Arab culture with us, whether we like it or not. It's this counterfeit package deal. Languages, linguistics. One wants to talk about. I mentioned, for example, like mihrabs and masajid. That's a pre-Islamic Arab thing about directional indicator. So get rid of mihrabs if you have to. Whatever. If you want to deculturate Islam, unless you want to argue the case, well, the Prophet himself accepted it's okay. And there's a whole, that's another discussion in itself about that type of understanding of how you permit or not permit things in the religion. Then before courts of justice, Sayyidina Umar rode a horse offered for sale, but it became sick. The owner disputed with Umar, so Shurayh al-Iraqi was appointed to arbitrate. He said, you took it when it was fit, and you are responsible to return it in the same condition. Umar paid the price. He was caliph, by the way. And Shurayh was asked to adjudicate Shurayh. And yet Shurayh was appointed to a judicial post. So, Omar as caliph is then having someone else adjudicate a case. He doesn't adjudicate his own case. He lets someone else adjudicate because he's not neutral. The man adjudicates in the favor of the owner of the horse, and Umar has to pay for it. That's just a slight example. This is why we have a proof that in our tradition, everyone is equal before the law, and it includes the leader himself. So if the leader has to be equal, then it includes all those under his authority, his ri'ayah, so to say. Before a judge, the judge is under the duty to treat litigants equally, both in regard to the application of the basic principles of justice and in conduct of trials, such as the matter of seating and manner, which I mentioned, for example, dress. And so this is Majalla article verse 1799 in the Majalla. So when I didn't quote from in the Majalla, we showed you, this text right here. Not in this book, because this only goes to so many of them. But I think it's the end when it deals with issues of judgments and judges and sitting in judgment. It has this as a maxim, as a legal principle, that judges have to be treating people equally when they judge them. So, and then of course, what about employment opportunities, welfare needs? So, for example, former slaves appointed by the Prophet ﷺ to governorships, such as Bilal al-Habashi and Zayd ibn Haritha. They were people of low status, but in Islam they're given a status of faith and obedience to the Prophet ﷺ. They merit that in the sense that they're obedience, and they're appointed to governorships. You know, as the Islamic conquest is there. So opportunities for people of different status to move around are there. So we accept that. You know, you're not fixed. There's no caste system in Islam. There's no indentured state you will have to stay in. Then Usama bin Zayd appointed military expeditioners at the age of 17. So that's another example of equality of distribution of a job. That was his job to lead the military expedition towards Byzantium. And of course, the Baitul Mal. Is that anyone can have access to Baitul Mal irrespective of how much you contribute to it. So these are things which, you know, we've had in our tradition. If you need to argue, demonstrate these to people. Does Islam have these concepts of constitutional equality? There are 4 of them. Here's some evidence for you to say, yeah, you know, and remember, this is not you don't have to give like a treatise of it. This is not you have like pages of proof. These are historical precedents that our scholars have examined. That yes, we have this tradition there of equitableness in our tradition, and we need to understand it. And what's interesting is that, you know, we know these things. I mean, at some level, you know, maybe we know that we have a religion that's like this, but we don't know why it's like that. Or maybe we're going to try to practice it all the time. Inshallah, we will. Inshallah. General duties, obligations, taxation, military. So we have here then the issue of zakat, who has to take it. That's an obligation. It's shared through the community. The jizya appointed to the Ahl Dhimma, of course, it's restricted. You know, zakat is any Muslim who has wealth, so even a child has wealth who's now liable for zakat has to pay. But jizya, you know, if you're talking about the taxation that goes towards the Ahl Dhimma within the Islamic rule, quote unquote. It's only for men who are military age and are able to be conscripted. Women, children, the old are free from that. So it's actually, Muslims actually pay more into that. And zakat, you know, does have distribution issues there where it goes. And of course, there is some debate, you know, who can receive zakat. In the United States, for example, there is a very common fatwa that zakat can go towards mosques and institutions in this country. That position, though, is considered by most jurists an aberrant position. It's not considered a mainstream classical position. The classical scholars I mean basically non-modern scholars who probably are still warm in their graves or are still breathing amongst us. Yusuf Qaradawi really appointed that position and espoused this tradition, this understanding of zakat towards these issues of foundations and masajid. Under the rubric of fi sabilillah as being sort of a disclassification of fi sabilillah. But that is considered by most majority scholars across the madhab as being more aberrant than normal. But in the United States, it has become a predominant position. You see masajid taking in zakat. The classical majority position is the one that's the stronger position of that one. Is that zakat only is transferable to a human being, someone who can receive ownership of it and distribute it freely. So you can give them the money or whatever it is, and they can take it. It becomes their own. They own it, and they can do with it what they want. A building can't do that, technically. Of course, that might open up then, if that's the case, then once we have this definition of zakat, to say from Qaradawi's understanding, that then can help. That if you are accepting it as a very strong, valid position, okay, if you do that. Then what it also means is that could probably pass over then when we come to the concept in the United States, for example, when corporations are considered entities themselves as opposed to people. You could probably draw a relationship there, by qiyas, because it's a similar thing in reality. Anyway. Yes, question.
Yes, I was wondering, historically Muslims had bodies that would collect zakat collectively. And people have been appointed
to collect it, and there are also recipients of the cap that helps to pay their efforts.
Okay. So just the follow-up question would then be, for example, distribution of that, would that be allowed for minority welfare within that Muslim country? If not,
You mean non-Muslims?
Yeah, to non-Muslim, like al-Dhimma. And wouldn't that be discrimination under law?
Yeah, there is this debate among classical scholars. I use that, I go back to that term classical, but that whether non-Muslims can receive zakat. There's debate. There are always, there are those who will say yes, they can receive it. Those who say no, they can't. Obviously, in a contemporary context, that would be rather discriminatory, obviously. And so, there are points there where you will have, positions that are clearly discriminatory. In our context today, with our norms, we would say it's discriminatory. In the context when it was pronounced, it probably wasn't considered discriminatory. It wasn't perceived negatively. Like when Sayyidina Umar required Jews and Christians of the conquered lands to wear certain types of clothing to be distinct. That's like Jews wearing the Stars of David. And under Nazi Germany. There was that same historical thing. You make them look different, and you can clearly see them different. Obviously, in our contemporary, recent experience historically, we have a really powerful precedent where that was a negative thing. And some people actually draw that relationship to say, no, Omar, say, see, this is an example of Islamic fascism. They make that. But in the time when Omar was alive, it was pretty common in all around the world, where place you go, you would have seen this type of qualifying people in different ways. So in their mindset, even his righteous mindset, there was nothing inherently wrong in that. That's all I can say. And that goes back to the context that has to be about, we have to really remember in our times that they are contextualized events and pronouncements and activities in their time, in the people's frame of mind. And we as Muslims exalt and raise up that first generation, and of course they are better than we are in many ways. But I always remind people, before, and you've heard me say this, but I'll say it again. Remember that when we can talk about the Prophet's companions, and they are better than we are, and I don't believe that I'm as Imam Rabbani said, I'm no better than the dust on the nose of the horse of Muawiyah, the Prophet. I'm not better than that dust on that horse's nose. Okay, so I don't, but understand also, it's that community which received verses about adultery and the backbiting. There were backbiting companions. There were adulterous companions. They were falling into those things that people fall into. The companions knew about brotherhood, but still Sayyidina Aisha in a hawza with a group of people shooting arrows to Sayyidina Umar. And he was the beloved son-in-law, cousin of the Prophet, and she was the beloved wife, and here they are on a battlefield against each other. And they clearly understood the concept of brotherhood. She was a knowledgeable woman, or you could take religion from her. He was the gate of knowledge, and here they were. We don't talk about that now. That was their ijtihad and their thing. The reality is they were people in conflict, even though they were both intimately associated with a living Prophet. So go figure. Let's not let's see things what they are. This is not to just sort of neutralize their prominence and their fadail, but it's not to also just we learn a lesson from that, is that the only people who are sinless and who don't make mistakes are prophets, and everyone else, I don't care who you are, can make a mistake. And that's it. But some mistakes by some are small things that are great, and some things are so great that we don't see them as great anymore. That's another discussion.
Sure, I have a question. About the Baitul Mal. So what was the main source of funding for the Baitul Mal? And was it like you know how we have Federal Reserve or something? Was it something similar?
Well, most, in our history, Baitul Mal, as when it probably was more substantively a real thing, was right. Yeah, I mean, when it really was mostly from what? Because of what? It was conquest that filled the coffers. I mean, if there ever was a conquest government, it would have been the Umayyads. They were a society built upon conquest. They got their wealth from conquest. They weren't mostly farmers and businessmen. They may have had them, but the empire took wealth from conquest. And traditionally, the Ottoman Empire, much of its wealth was built on what? Conquest and taxation. And that's why you find interesting legal tax codes when it comes to the Ottomans. They were very good at finding things to tax, to support. And that's why I mentioned, kharaj, taxation is a legitimate government practice. That's also something which isn't something which must be equitable and we deal with as Muslims. But the point is, I don't know, I'd have to really look into the history of the Baitul Mal, how it developed. But what knowledge I do have is that a lot of it in our period of classical Islam was that source, either conquest or taxation. That was it. And how effectively it was done and when it was done, I'm sure we can find a lot of inconsistency. We know the thing called Baitul Mal, but how it was understood, when it was applied, how was it, who had access to it. I'm sure if you were to do research on it, you'd find a lot of different expressions of it under that rubric, Baitul Mal. Okay.
So this could be understood as a more secular concept, and it's not more spiritual, like a zakat concept.
Yeah, this is it's like a public fund, a trust for the community. When the community needs it, you can have access to it.
So
which on the premise is a wonderful thing. I mean, wow, that sounds great, but that's something which requires monitoring it and what kind of funds go into it, where to get the funds for it. Those are other issues, and those are issues I mean, if you think about it, we've heard of a Baitul Mal, but we almost know nothing really about it, how it would work. Because God, it exists in our tradition, but it's very limited to its discussion because it's one of those things which is limited because of the fact it allows us, and this is what Ibn Ashur mentions, in his Maqasid al-Sharia, is that I think I'm bringing it up. I don't know if I'm going to talk about it yet, but there is a preponderance of details when it comes to ibadat in our tradition. There is not a preponderance of issues of mu'amalat, details, when it comes to business transactions, things like that. There's a lot more, there's a scarcity of details, because those things are much more fluid in cultural context. Ibadat are very fixed. We pray, every generation basically prays the same. But every generation may not have the same sources of income and businesses. Those things are very fluid. So it is the Lord's wisdom in Allah and His Messenger not to be so specific, because if Allah was very specific, like you believe, all you can sell is dates, then all any Muslim could sell would all be date dealers. Eat halal and tayyiban. That's very general. So ibaha, or permission, or access, without restriction, is a fundamental principle, a default. And then there are other things which then are clarified when they have prescriptions, how you can take the prescribed thing and make it permissible, like meat or flesh of an animal. So you should be able to go back with these notes, whatever you got, and talk to someone about these are the general things of the issues of equality in constitutional law. And we can see in Islam that those concepts exist with Muslims. So Newt Gingrich is a little bit not quite right when he says that principally, fundamentally, we're incongruent. He's really wrong. Okay, and it's a rather bit of chauvinism on his part to which is a problem, as always the case, is that when you're the top dog, any other dog has fundamentally a flaw with it. So you know, when Muslims were the cock of the rock in Islamic world history, and when kaftans and turbans were the rage and the mode in Poland and all the other Eastern European lands and kingdoms, when people try to dress like the sultans in Istanbul, you know, things turn. You know, it's he who has, you know, he who sits on the top of the mountain is the one who often dictates what everyone else does around him. And so that's just normal. That's what humans are, you know. We follow the Joneses. Yeah, so that's a common problem. So today, you know, remember Uncle Tommy and the concept of Uncle Tom we learned about in Civil War, post-Civil War America. People call Uncle Tom. People who try to, you know, oh, you might have used that term in the 70s, you want to brown those people, you know. You're trying to, you know, just sort of do whatever it is that the current one would fit in. Okay, from there we get to objectives, the maqasid of Sharia. The maqasid are very important. Now, let's go back here to maqasid. Okay, hold on from there. When we talk about maqasid, we're talking about where scholars over generations examining. Think of early jurists. Early jurists were the first. When you go back to the primitive jurisprudence in Islam, it's usually an issue of a question being asked, wanting an answer, and it was recorded, or it was memorized, or it was recorded in some manner. And then you start collecting all these questions and answers. And then, you know, and so that becomes how it starts. And then, you know, as it moves through